3.5 million developers, and then, out of nowhere, Microsoft pulled the plug. It was an absolute mammoth of a community, literally the beating heart of the entire Windows ecosystem. You'd think a company would protect an asset that massive with its life, right?
Why did Microsoft pull the plug on the most popular programming language in the world? The demise of Visual Basic wasn't some natural, slow decline where developers just, drifted away to better tools. No, this was a sudden, deliberate execution from within. Microsoft looked at the most beloved thing they had ever made, a language millions of people relied on, and decided to kill it anyway. It was basically a casualty, sacrificed to win a completely different war.
Okay, so our story begins in California with an independent software designer named Alan Cooper. He was super fascinated by the technical guts of the new Windows operating system, specifically how different pieces of software dynamically link together. So he built a personal project he called Tripod. It was basically a shell construction set. It let a user just drag and drop visual objects like buttons, text boxes, and lists directly onto a blank canvas to build interfaces without writing reams and reams of code. In March of 1988, Cooper actually finds himself in a boardroom on Microsoft's campus demonstrating this directly to Bill Gates. Gates is sitting there, totally stunned, watching Cooper build a working program in seconds and asks him how he did it. Cooper's legendary reply? "It's magic, Bill."
Microsoft immediately bought Cooper's creation, codenaming it Ruby. But after some messy internal politics, the plan to use it as a Windows shell got quietly scrapped. Now, when Cooper asked Gates to sell it back to him, Gates flat out refused. It was way too valuable. Instead, Microsoft made a really fateful decision. They took Cooper's elegant, visual, drag-and-drop engine and mashed it up with an internal BASIC language engine. BASIC, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, was this very simple, forgiving language that Microsoft had actually built its early empire on. But here's the catch. Cooper, being a serious professional designer, frankly looked down on BASIC. He thought it was clunky and primitive.
But by fusing these two things together, you could draw an interface entirely by hand and then write easily editable BASIC code to make it actually do stuff. In May of 1991, Microsoft unleashed this hybrid onto the world as Visual Basic. Bill Gates himself did the demo, building a little calendar app on stage and called the product awesome. InfoWorld magazine hailed it as a stunning new miracle. It was an explosive debut. But picture this, sitting right there in the front row was Alan Cooper, and he was absolutely horrified. The father of this elegant visual designer loathed BASIC, and he was incredibly frustrated by what Microsoft had bolted onto his creation.
To understand why this was such a big deal, you have to realize that before Visual Basic, programming for Windows was brutal. You had to wrestle with the Win32 API, which was this vast, totally unforgiving interface. You needed thick reference books, deep expertise, and just enormous patience to put a single solitary button on a screen. It was a walled garden for hardcore professionals. Visual Basic just absolutely bulldozed that wall. You didn't need a computer science degree anymore. You just drew a window, dragged a button onto it, clicked it, typed 2 lines of basic code, and boom, you had a real working Windows application.
This wasn't just a new tool. It was an absolute revolution. It was the democratization of programming. Suddenly, office workers, weekend hobbyists, and curious teenagers were becoming actual software developers. The adoption spread like wildfire. At its absolute peak, a staggering 66%, that's 2/3 of all business applications on Windows, were built with Visual Basic. That is wild. It was this unprecedented empire of democratized software creation that basically drove the entire Windows ecosystem.
Okay, moving into Section 1, the Golden Age and the looming threat.
So as these VB applications got massive, that magical simplicity started to show some major cracks. Developers were eventually being forced back into those painful Windows programming interfaces that VB was supposed to protect them from in the first place. Plus, the external threats were mounting fast. A rival tool popped up called Delphi, made by Borland, and it was just better, faster, cleaner, and invented by a brilliant guy named Anders Hellsberg. But even more critically, Microsoft was suddenly fighting an existential war against Sun Microsystems Java, a platform that literally threatened to make the Windows operating system totally irrelevant.
Microsoft needed a grand answer to Java. Well, actually, scratch that. They needed a total paradigm shift. Their solution was an entirely new platform called .NET. It was designed to be this modern, unified foundation for all future Windows development. And in a ruthlessly brilliant move, Microsoft poached Anders Hellsberg, yep, the exact same guy who built Delphi, and had him build their shiny new flagship language, C#. So the mandate comes down from the top. Literally everything at Microsoft is going to be rebuilt around this new .NET foundation. But this massive corporate pivot left a 3.5 million developer-sized elephant in the room. What exactly do you do with them?
Visual Basic was built on older, totally different technology that had absolutely zero to do with .NET. So how on earth do you handle this massive, wildly loyal community when their tools and their code are completely incompatible with Microsoft's shiny new corporate vision? Which brings us to Section 2, the Great Visual Basic Betrayal.
Microsoft made a decision that the community would never, ever forgive. They forced Visual Basic into the .NET world. In 2002, they released VB.NET, but the reality of this release was absolutely devastating for developers. There was no backward compatibility. None. No clean migration path. You couldn't just move the millions upon millions of lines of classic VB code that were currently running real businesses over to the new system. Developers were told they had to substantially rewrite their applications from scratch. They had to learn a completely new, complicated way of doing things, filled with the exact same complexity they had happily avoided for a decade. In one unforced error, Microsoft took Visual Basic's single greatest strength, its accessible simplicity, and just threw it away.
As you might guess, the reaction from the community was absolute fury. I mean, these were everyday people whose actual livelihoods depended on Microsoft's promise, and now they are basically being told their skills and their code were entirely obsolete. The developers actually organized. They launched massive public petitions, literally begging Microsoft to keep supporting classic Visual Basic. But Microsoft just ruthlessly ignored them. They stayed laser-focused on their war with Java, and they pushed classic VB right off a cliff into retirement.
And that leads into our final part, Section 3, the ghostly legacy.
The thing is, the new VB.NET never even came close to capturing the old magic. It just became a permanent second-class citizen to C#. Microsoft had essentially shattered, scattered, and demoralized the largest, most vibrant programming community that had ever existed on the planet. As one tech observer perfectly nailed it at the time, the dream of programming for the masses died in 2002. That beautiful, empowering idea of the citizen developer, the idea that an ordinary person with zero formal computer science training could just sit down and build real software, was totally dismantled.
And the fallout from this is absolutely fascinating to watch today. For the last 25 years, the entire tech industry has basically been desperately trying to rebuild what Microsoft threw away. Think about all the modern no-code or low-code tools you see today, stuff like Zapier, Wix, or Airtable. They're all just chasing that simple, on-your-side magic that Visual Basic achieved almost by accident back in 1991. Every new wave of citizen developer software is just trying to recapture what was lost.
But here is the ultimate, honestly slightly hilarious irony of this whole story. Visual Basic was so massive, so deeply ingrained in the business world, that Microsoft actually couldn't fully kill it. They have been forced to keep the old VB6 runtime alive and supported in Windows for over 2 decades. It's literally a ghost in the machine that completely outlived its own execution. It just sits there, a lingering monument to the exact moment a company looked at 3.5 million developers using the most beloved thing it had ever made and decided to pull the plug anyway. So it leaves us with a big question. Will the tech industry ever truly recapture the accidental magic of Visual Basic? The whole story of the Visual Basic Wars reminds us of a really profound loss in the tech world. Alan Cooper's visual designer, married to a language he hated, managed to empower millions of people, only to be dismantled by the very company that built it up. As we watch the massive rise of AI and all these new coding tools today, will we ever see that level of true, widespread accessibility again? It's definitely something to think about.